They lied when they said Tudor families were peaceful places. Behind every polite smile was a bargain no one dared to name. Power moved in whispers, in lowered eyes, in hands that never trembled, even while shaping an entire household's fate. What seemed ordinary was only a mask stretched over silent wars. Tonight, we step inside those rooms and watch how women ruled without ever being seen. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to step quietly into a Tudor noble household, the first impression would be one of order, servants moving with practiced rhythm, corridors lit by muted daylight, and every object placed with intention. Yet beneath that outward calm, the house functioned less like a family home and more like a political center. Every room held a purpose, and every interaction carried weight far beyond simple domestic life. The walls themselves seemed to absorb conversations, storing alliances, resentments, and unspoken agreements that shaped the fate of everyone living within. A Tudor household was not defined by warmth or intimacy. It was defined by hierarchy. The person who appeared to lead, often the patriarch, did not always possess the most meaningful influence. His position was visible, but visibility was not the same as control. Much of the true decision-making happened in quieter spaces, in moments where his presence was not required, while he attended court, managed estates, or negotiated with other men of his rank. The internal balance of the household shifted through subtler forces. Women occupied the center of these forces, though their power was rarely acknowledged openly. A mother, a wife, to a sister, or a daughter could steer the emotional climate of the entire estate without raising her voice. Their movements were observed closely by servants, visitors, and relatives, as if every gesture held a coded message. In many cases, it did. A polite greeting could reinforce an alliance. A brief pause could suggest disapproval. A look held a moment too long could signal a warning. Even silence had the ability to alter the atmosphere of a room. Those who lived within these walls understood the silent structure of authority. The household was a system in which political interests, inheritance calculations, and social expectations merged into a single, intricate mechanism. Meals were not merely shared food but negotiations. Gatherings in the hall were not entertainment, but chances to assess loyalties. The bedchambers and private galleries were the true centers of influence, where conversations took place without witnesses and decisions were shaped in shadows rather than meetings. It was a place where power did not belong solely to the person with the highest title. It belonged to the one who could manage relationships, who understood the shifting tensions between kin, the ambitions of extended family, and the delicate position of servants who carried news from room to room. Women learned early that attention to small moments mattered more than grand actions. A glance, a whisper, a pause at the top of the stairs could do more to influence the household than any command issued in the hall. The political nature of daily life created an environment where everyone watched, and everyone was watched. Nothing escaped notice. The order in which people entered a room, the direction a wife looked during supper, the tone a mother used when speaking to a daughter-in-law. Outsiders might have believed these were trivial gestures, but within the household, they were signals. They shaped perceptions, guided choices, and determined who felt secure and who felt vulnerable. A single misstep could shift one's standing for months. Most revealing of all was the subtle labor women performed to maintain or redirect the flow of influence. They managed the rhythm of the home, from the arrangement of servants to the upbringing of heirs, embedding themselves in every layer of decision-making. Their presence in daily routines made their absence even more noticeable. and absence itself became a message. They carried knowledge of family histories, fragile alliances, and private grievances. This knowledge was a form of power as real as land or wealth, though men rarely admitted it openly. Seen from a distance, a Tudor noble family appeared orderly and unified. But to stand inside that house, even for a moment, was to witness a social structure built on careful restraint. Nothing was random, and little was innocent. Every household was both a shelter and a battlefield, its rooms arranged to hide conflicts as much as to host guests. Influence moved quietly, like a draught of air through a closed window, felt more than seen, shaping lives without announcing itself. Inside this world, women did not simply exist within a political unit, they sustained it. Their actions, visible or concealed, formed the backbone of the household's stability. They mediated disputes, nudged decisions, and anticipated threats before they emerged. Without them, the structure would have collapsed. With them, it endured. Tenser, strategic, always shifting, beneath a surface that pretended to be serene. Everything described here reveals only the outer layer of a household built on quiet maneuvering. There were choices made behind closed doors that determined far more than daily routines. And someone within this family already senses a change approaching, though no one has spoken of it aloud. A Tudor household often appeared to run under the authority of men. Yet anyone who observed its daily rhythm for more than a moment would notice that the real movement of the home flowed through the hands of its women. They held no official titles, signed no documents, and rarely spoke in councils. But the direction of the family's future depended heavily on their presence. Their influence did not arrive through open declarations, but through the quiet, steady shaping of the household's internal world. In rooms where decisions seemed minor, their choices settled into the structure of the family with long-lasting effects. Women understood how fragile a noble family could be when strained by ambition, lineage, or shifting political ties. They were raised to recognize patterns of loyalty, behavior, and expectation long before anyone allowed them to speak of such things. Through bloodlines, marriages, and the bearing of children, they carried the threads that connected one generation to the next. A daughter's birth could strengthen a relationship between two distant households. A son's survival could determine whether land remained united or disappeared into the hands of rivals. These realities made every stage of a woman's life a matter of strategic importance, whether or not she wished it to be. In many estates, the women's influence could be traced through small, deliberate movements rather than overt action. They managed the flow of information between relatives, carefully choosing what to reveal and what to keep hidden. They rearranged the staff quietly, placing trusted servants in key positions where rumors tended to gather. They shaped the upbringing of children through daily routines, selecting tutors, guiding behavior, and deciding which alliances to encourage. These tasks looked domestic, even ordinary, but within a Tudor household, they were mechanisms of control. Their authority was strengthened by the silence surrounding it. Because it was not officially recognized, it could not be officially challenged. Men rarely confronted the quiet force shaping their homes, partly because doing so required acknowledging how dependent they were on it. A husband might believe he directed the family's affairs, but the atmosphere of the home, its rhythms, its tensions, its loyalties, was often set long before he noticed. Women did not need to speak to make themselves heard. Their choices traveled through daily life unnoticed yet deeply felt. Even marriages, which seemed to place women in passive roles, offered them opportunities to expand or reinforce the family's standing. A well-chosen bride strengthened external alliances, and a carefully arranged match for a sister or daughter could resolve conflicts that might otherwise threaten the estate. These negotiations were conducted politely, almost delicately, but they shaped the power structure of entire regions. Behind every union stood women who understood what weighed on the scales, even if they never appeared in the final agreements. The bearing of children carried its own influence. Women knew that lineage was the axis on which noble fortunes turned. Their ability to produce heirs, or not, determined how the family name would move forward. This reality placed immense pressure on them, and yet they learned to wield that pressure in subtle ways. A woman who understood her importance could negotiate for better treatment or for greater involvement in household decisions. Even her silence could shift expectations, prompting relatives to reconsider alliances or redistribute attention. Within this system, the power women carried was both pervasive and invisible. It appeared in gentle guidance, in the control of domestic space, in the steady accumulation of knowledge about those who entered and left the home. It spread through long-term planning rather than short bursts of action. And because it operated without acknowledgement, it survived even in the most rigid households, adapting as generations changed. A Tudor noble family could lose land, wealth, or status, but the quiet authority of its women tended to endure. Seen from the outside, it might appear that these women accepted their restricted public roles. But acceptance was only one surface. Beneath it lay strategy, observation, and a constant awareness of how fragile influence could be. Their power did not require recognition to function. It required only patience, clarity, and the ability to understand what others preferred not to see. In this way, their unnamed role became one of the most enduring forces within Tudor society, shaping families from the inside while never stepping into the light. Everything described here reveals how influence moved through the household without a single title to justify it. There were decisions made quietly by women that shifted the balance of families more than any decree spoken aloud. And someone within this home is already preparing a different kind of strategy, one that others will notice only when it is too late. Speech within a Tudor noble household carried a weight far greater than the words themselves. Conversations moved gently, framed with courtesy, yet every phrase held layers that were understood only by those accustomed to navigating its subtleties. A smile offered across a hall was never simply a gesture of warmth. It was a controlled expression, shaped to conceal more than it revealed. In this environment, politeness functioned as a shield, a method of protection, and at times a silent weapon. The household worked on the assumption that no one ever spoke without intention. Noble families valued restraint, believing that composure signaled refinement. Women, in particular, learned early that directness was rarely advantageous. Their influence depended not on volume but on nuance. A gentle greeting could suggest support, distance, or warning, depending on the circumstances. They understood that the safest way to communicate dissatisfaction was through words that appeared harmless to an outsider. A comment about the weather, the state of the gardens, or a relative's absence could carry implications that shifted relationships even as the surface remained calm. Smiles played a central role in this system of coded communication. They softened tension, disguised resentment, and reassured those who needed reassurance. But these expressions were often calculated, shaped to mask discomfort or secure an advantage. A woman might greet a rival with a smile that appeared cordial, yet both parties understood exactly how little warmth lay behind it. The ability to maintain this facade was not seen as deceit. It was a necessary skill for survival. In a world where open conflict risked scandal, a managed expression was a safer form of defense. Even tone carried significance. Soft speech did not necessarily signal agreement. It could express disapproval more effectively than a raised voice. Women learned to speak in ways that could not be accused of impropriety, yet left listeners uneasy. A seemingly innocent remark could undermine someone's standing without ever naming the issue directly. Those who excelled in this practice gained reputations for grace. not manipulation, because their influence was invisible to those who did not know where to look. In formal gatherings, layers of meaning accumulated with every exchange. Seated around long tables or standing in well-furnished chambers, individuals traded remarks that sounded benign but were shaped to test boundaries. A question about someone's health might hint at concern, or it might imply weakness. A compliment on a child's behavior could carry unspoken criticism of the parents. Conversations that seemed light and social were often the most dangerous, because they allowed individuals to position themselves without appearing to challenge anyone directly. Courtesy also offered cover for self-preservation. When tensions rose within the household, over inheritance, marriage arrangements, or shifting alliances, women relied on polite language to avoid suspicion. Their words could influence decisions, delay actions, or redirect attention, all without provoking confrontation. This made politeness an effective form of camouflage. By speaking gently and smiling appropriately, they could conceal their involvement in matters that affected the entire estate. Others might suspect, but suspicion was not evidence. The outward politeness remained intact. At times, the absence of language carried even greater force. A silent nod, a delayed reply, or a faint change in expression could communicate more clearly than a spoken sentence. Those who understood these cues could navigate the household with greater ease, while those who missed them risked finding themselves on the wrong side of internal politics. Silence allowed women to reveal or conceal their intentions without exposing themselves to scrutiny. It was both a refuge and a tool, shaped by circumstance and necessity. Politeness acted as a form of armor in an environment where direct accusations could result in severe consequences. A well-placed phrase could challenge someone's credibility while appearing entirely respectful. At the same time, overly enthusiastic courtesy could signal desperation or insincerity, which made the balance difficult to maintain. Women spent years learning how to manage their words with precision, understanding that the wrong tone in the wrong moment could reshape alliances that took decades to build. To an outsider, the household might have appeared harmonious, full of graceful exchanges and smiling faces. But anyone familiar with its rhythms could sense the tension woven through even the most pleasant interactions. Every conversation was a negotiation. Every shared glance, a calculation. The politeness that defined Tudor noble life was not evidence of peace. It was evidence of constant awareness. A woman who mastered these codes could guide the emotions of a room with only a few measured phrases. The language of courtesy did not simply hide conflict. It formed the battlefield on which conflict took place. Power moved through soft words, careful smiles, and deliberately chosen silences. What appeared to be a simple exchange often determined who held influence and who slipped quietly into irrelevance. Those who understood this lived with a constant alertness, knowing that a single polite sentence could determine their future within the house. Everything described here reveals how restraint became the primary instrument of influence. There were words spoken with gentleness that carried consequences far beyond their surface. Somewhere within this household, a single smile is already preparing to shift the balance in ways no one expects. Within a Tudor noble household, nothing appeared more harmless than a polite smile exchanged across a corridor or during a meal. Yet those who lived inside such walls understood that no gesture was without purpose. A smile could soften a tense moment, disguise resentment, or present false reassurance. It could also introduce doubt, unsettle a rival, or signal that something had shifted beneath the surface. The household relied on such ambiguity. People learned not to trust the outward calm, because every expression carried the potential to alter the balance of power. Even the smallest movement, a tilt of the head, a tightening of the lips, a slightly delayed response, could function as a calculated message. These gestures were not impulsive. They were shaped by years of observing how families rose or declined based on their internal politics. Women in particular mastered the art of appearing serene while measuring the intentions of everyone around them. They smiled when they needed protection, when they needed information, and when they wished to unsettle someone without speaking a single word. The veneer of courtesy made these actions seem benign, but they were anything but accidental. Within shared spaces like great halls, galleries, or dining rooms, polite gestures worked as signals that could be interpreted differently depending on who was watching. A mother might smile at her daughter-in-law to imply approval, while the same gesture might reassure a guest or warn a servant. Those who knew how to read these subtleties could sense shifting alliances before any open statement was made. Those who could not were at a disadvantage from the moment they entered the room. The household thrived on the tension between visible harmony and hidden conflict. Silence, too, became a form of expression. When a woman paused before answering a question, the delay could carry more weight than anything she might say. It might communicate disapproval, suspicion, or caution. A quiet withdrawal from conversation could shift the atmosphere of a gathering, encouraging some to step forward while prompting others to retreat. In these moments, silence acted as a blade, unseen but sharp enough to cut. Those who imposed silence deliberately often wielded more influence than those who filled the room with words. Over time, these silent and subtle tactics shaped the social structure of the family. Emotional intimacy was rare. Strategic awareness was constant. People learned to study each other's faces during meal times, watching for small signs of tension or unexpected warmth. Even servants became attuned to the meaning behind a raised eyebrow or a forced smile. They carried these interpretations into other rooms, spreading conclusions that influenced how others behaved. In this way, gestures traveled faster than speech, creating a current of speculation that never fully settled. A smile could also serve as a test. When directed at someone whose loyalty was uncertain, it invited a reaction that revealed more than any question could. A genuine smile returned too quickly might suggest eagerness to please. A hesitant one might expose fear or guilt. A refusal to acknowledge the gesture could be interpreted as defiance. Individuals who understood this dynamic learned to respond with equal care, knowing that a careless expression could expose private intentions. The household was a stage, and every face performed. The lack of visible weapons inside these homes did not diminish the sense of conflict. Instead, the absence of open aggression intensified the importance of symbols and gestures. Words were soft, movements small, but their effects reached far. A well-timed smile could shift suspicion from one person to another. A moment of silence could end an argument without requiring a single accusation. The household maintained its structure not through force, but through the careful manipulation of perception. Survival depended on recognizing the difference between sincerity and strategic performance. Even moments of seeming affection held layers beneath them. A comforting touch on a child's shoulder might reassure the child, while simultaneously reminding others who truly guided the family. A polite laugh at a joke could imply support or reveal which alliances were solidifying. Nothing existed in isolation. Every gesture was part of a larger calculation. Over time, these subtle signals accumulated, shaping reputations and determining who held influence at any given moment. For those who lived within this delicate system, awareness became instinctive. They learned that a smile could command obedience, a quiet pause could end a debate, and a well-timed expression of grace could dismantle a rival's strategy without appearing confrontational. The most effective individuals understood that open hostility rarely succeeded. Power moved most efficiently through gestures that others underestimated. In a setting where propriety limited open conflict, subtlety became the most valued form of strength. Daily life in a Tudor household thus unfolded beneath an intricate web of controlled expressions. Faces revealed little truth, and gestures often contradicted spoken words. Every person carried the weight of unspoken meaning, shaping conversations while avoiding scandal. To navigate such an environment successfully required patience, discipline, and the ability to interpret what others preferred to hide. The politeness that outsiders admired was, in reality, the surface of an ongoing struggle, one fought without blades, yet capable of leaving deep marks. Everything described here shows how a simple gesture could unsettle an entire household. There were smiles offered with gentleness that contained consequences far beyond their appearance. Within these walls, a quiet silence is preparing to reveal more than any spoken accusation. Marriage within a Tudor noble household did not begin with affection, nor was it expected to grow from personal longing. It functioned as a calculated arrangement, shaped by the interests of families who sought stability, advantage, or survival. Women stood at the center of these arrangements, not as independent decision-makers, but as the bridges through which alliances flowed. Their futures were decided long before they had the maturity to understand what those futures meant, and their marriages carried consequences that extended far beyond the walls of their new homes. To the families involved, a woman was not only a daughter or sister, but she was also a political connection waiting to be activated. Every union was weighed carefully. Land, lineage, debts, reputation, and influence all played roles in determining whether a match would strengthen or weaken a family's position. Girls were evaluated for their potential to secure beneficial ties, just as young men were measured for their ability to maintain or expand the family's reach. The negotiations rarely involved the couple themselves. Instead, relatives discussed terms like merchants calculating risk, knowing that the wrong match could endanger a family's standing for decades. Emotional preference held little relevance. A marriage that pleased the heart but weakened the household was dismissed as a liability. When a woman moved into her husband's estate, she entered a structure already shaped by history, expectation, and ambition. Yet, her role did not end with fulfilling obligations. She was expected to carry the identity of her birth family into her new home, subtly reinforcing alliances and ensuring ongoing ties between the two households. Every letter she wrote, every courtesy she extended, and every child she bore contributed to the strengthening or weakening of the connection between families. Her presence became a constant reminder that marriage was not merely a personal union but a contract with far-reaching implications. In many cases, a woman's value to her new household increased or decreased, depending on how her birth family behaved. A father who fell into debt or scandal could diminish her standing overnight. A brother who rose in political favor could elevate her influence without her saying a word. These shifting conditions created an environment in which women lived with constant awareness of how external events shaped their position. Their marriages were never private. They existed as visible nodes in a network of ambitions that extended through multiple generations. The consequences of these arrangements became even more pronounced when wealth or inheritance was at stake. Families used marriage to consolidate property, secure claims, or resolve disputes over land. A well-chosen match could merge estates, bringing together resources that had been divided for decades. A poorly chosen one could fracture the family's control, sending valuable assets into the hands of rivals. Women bore the weight of these expectations quietly. Their identities became entwined with calculations they did not make. Yet they were held responsible for the outcomes. Even within the household, a wife's position reflected the political nature of her marriage. Her behavior was scrutinized to determine whether she was upholding the reputation of both her birth family and her husband's. Small missteps could be interpreted as signs of weakness or incompetence. A woman who managed these expectations with composure earned respect, though it rarely translated to explicit power. Instead, her influence moved through quieter channels. How she hosted guests, how she guided her children, how she navigated the competing interests of relatives. Love, when it existed, developed as a byproduct of circumstance rather than as a foundation. Many couples grew accustomed to each other, finding comfort in shared routines. Others maintained distance, fulfilling obligations without seeking connection. The absence of affection did not signal failure. It simply reflected a system that valued stability over emotional fulfillment. People learned to accept that marriage served the household before it served the individuals within it. The structure demanded compliance, and compliance shaped their inner lives. Yet within this framework, women discovered ways to assert a measure of control. By managing relationships between families, they could influence how disputes were settled or how resources were distributed. By guiding the upbringing of children, they affected the future of the lineage. Their ability to navigate competing expectations became a source of strength, even if it remained unacknowledged. The marriage contract might have defined their roles, but their actions determined how that contract functioned in daily life. For many women, the burden of these responsibilities was heavy. They lived knowing that their marriages were judged not by personal happiness, but by political outcomes. Their success was measured in alliances, heirs, and the preservation of status. Still, they learned to move within these constraints, shaping the household's future with quiet persistence. The system demanded obedience, but obedience did not mean passivity. Their influence flowed beneath the surface, steady and constant. Everything described here reveals how marriage operated as the foundation of political survival. There were unions formed with a gentle ceremony that carried consequences far more severe than any public agreement suggested. Inside these carefully arranged bonds, a single decision is already beginning to shift loyalties in ways the household has yet to recognize. A mother-in-law in a Tudor noble household held a position that was rarely challenged, yet never openly celebrated. Her authority did not come from a title, but from years spent learning how the home functioned, its rhythms, its tensions, and how influence traveled from one room to another. By the time a new wife entered the family, the mother-in-law had already shaped the household's expectations. She understood the rituals that defined daily life, the unwritten rules that governed behavior, and the subtle boundaries that determined who belonged where. This knowledge allowed her to control others without ever appearing forceful. The daughter-in-law, stepping into her new life, found herself guided through a series of rituals that seemed harmless but served specific purposes. Instructions about where to sit, how to speak, or when to appear in public were framed as lessons meant to ease her transition. In reality, these directives allowed the mother-in-law to assess and adjust her influence. Every suggestion carried weight. A remark about posture could signal expectations for obedience. A comment about attire might reflect concerns about reputation. What seemed like advice was, in truth, a method of sculpting the younger woman into the shape the household required. This guidance extended into matters far more delicate than etiquette. A mother-in-law often monitored a young wife's fertility, health, and conduct, shaping how she navigated the pressures surrounding childbirth and inheritance. Questions about meals, rest, or daily activities were never casual. Each inquiry carried an underlying awareness that the continuation of the family line depended heavily on the daughter-in-law. The older woman's experience with these realities gave her a form of authority that few dared to challenge. She understood which remedies soothed discomfort, which fears were common, and which dangers accompanied each stage of pregnancy. Her guidance, whether welcomed or not, shaped the daughter-in-law's understanding of her role. Reputation also fell under her domain. A mother-in-law observed interactions between her son's wife and household members, noting which alliances formed naturally and which needed correcting. A young wife could rise or fall in the family's estimation based on how she navigated these first impressions. The older woman used gentle reminders, subtle corrections, and carefully chosen praise to mold the daughter-in-law's public image. In doing so, she ensured that the family's dignity remained protected and that the younger woman learned the importance of restraint and proper behavior. The strength of a mother-in-law's authority depended on her network. Years of managing servants, advising relatives, and maintaining connections with neighboring households gave her access to information that shaped her decisions. Servants brought her observations without being asked, Extended family members trusted her with concerns they shared with no one else. These networks allowed her to intervene before conflicts escalated. A quiet conversation in a hallway could redirect a brewing disagreement. A simple request for a servant to adjust a schedule could prevent two hostile relatives from meeting. Her influence moved invisibly, but its effects were unmistakable. A daughter-in-law learned quickly that arguing with such a figure rarely ended well. The older woman held the advantage of familiarity, experience, and expectation. Her presence could calm a room or silence a debate, even when her words sounded soft. Their implications carried weight. She knew when to intervene and when to let silence deliver the message for her. Those who underestimated her often found themselves isolated, misunderstood, or quietly redirected toward roles that offered little significance. Yet this authority was not always oppressive. Many women relied on their mothers-in-law for stability in unfamiliar households. The older woman's understanding of the family's history provided a sense of continuity. Her steady presence could offer reassurance to a young wife unsure of how to navigate her new responsibilities. Some relationships became partnerships, built on mutual respect and shared interest in protecting the household. But even in these cases, the balance of power remained clear. Guidance, no matter how gentle, always flowed downward. The most skilled mothers-in-law exercised their power without drawing attention. They influenced family decisions through timing rather than force, presenting opinions only when the moment favored them. They shaped routines by shifting responsibilities or adjusting expectations. Their authority was rooted in endurance. They had watched patterns repeat, and they knew how to act before a crisis became visible. While men debated political matters beyond the household, these women ensured that the home itself remained stable, if only on the surface. It was this combination of experience and subtlety that made them central figures. The household relied on their judgment, even when it pretended not to. Their power did not need recognition to be effective. It existed in every decision that shaped the family's daily life. For the daughter-in-law, understanding this dynamic was essential. Respect offered safety, and vigilance ensured survival. To misunderstand the mother-in-law's role was to misread the entire structure of the home. Everything described here reveals how authority grew quietly through years of observation and endurance. There were gestures and instructions delivered softly that carried consequences far deeper than their tone suggested. Within these rooms, a shift in guidance is about to unsettle the younger woman in ways she has not yet imagined. A Tudor household often appeared to run on the authority of those with visible power. Men with titles, women with established positions, and elders whose reputations carried weight. Yet the most significant shifts in influence frequently came from those who seemed least capable of shaping events. Women with no formal standing, limited voice, or minimal authority learned to survive through observation. Their silence allowed them to witness tensions others ignored, and their apparent weakness kept them overlooked in moments when attention might have restricted their movements. What seemed like vulnerability concealed a long-term strategy built on patience. These women rarely acted quickly. They watched how conversations unfolded, noting who hesitated, who dominated, and who concealed discomfort behind polite gestures. They paid attention to the shifting dynamics between relatives, learning which alliances held firm and which were beginning to fracture. Their awareness grew from daily exposure to the household's rhythms, listening from the edges of rooms, passing through corridors unnoticed, or completing tasks that placed them near private exchanges. Because they did not assert themselves openly, their presence faded into the background, granting them access to moments others dismissed as unimportant. The strength of their position lay in their ability to gather information. A whispered remark, a strained smile, or a poorly concealed disagreement could reveal paths toward influence. While those with authority engaged in visible negotiations, these women worked quietly to understand motivations. They learned who feared judgment, who resented oversight, and who sought approval. These insights, collected over months or years, allowed them to act with precision when the time finally arrived to make their presence felt. Their decisions were rarely impulsive. They acted only when the imbalance of the household created an opening that would not appear again. Their restraint often misled others into believing they lacked ambition or resolve. Relatives viewed them as passive participants in the family's affairs, unthreatening and easy to dismiss. This misjudgment offered protection. It allowed these women to refine their understanding of the household without attracting scrutiny. Many underestimated how deeply they perceived the politics occurring around them. They understood which gestures masked anxiety, which polite comments concealed anger, and which alliances were built on necessity rather than genuine trust. When these women finally acted, their choices carried disproportionate impact. A delayed remark placed at the right moment could shift public opinion within the household. A subtle correction of a rumor could redirect suspicion away from someone vulnerable or towards someone whose influence had become destabilizing. Small gestures, a withheld smile, an unexpected show of sympathy, or a suggestion delivered with disarming softness could weaken established power structures. Because they struck so rarely, their actions surprised even those who believed they understood the household's politics. Their power grew not from confrontation but from timing. They waited for situations in which stronger individuals revealed cracks in their authority. A quarrel between relatives, a misstep in a public gathering, or a poorly managed household decision provided opportunities. By speaking only when others had already eroded their own positions, these women appeared to offer clarity rather than challenge. Their interventions seemed helpful, even necessary, until the consequences became undeniable. Only then did the household realize how much direction had shifted due to someone it barely noticed. Observation taught them caution. They knew that acting too soon could bring overwhelming retaliation from those with greater formal authority. Acting too late could allow harmful alliances to solidify. The ideal moment often arrived in periods of uncertainty, when illness struck, when inheritance disputes arose, or when political tensions beyond the household forced internal adjustments. It was in these fragile environments that their long-developed understanding proved most effective. Their actions blended into the natural progression of events, appearing as logical outcomes rather than deliberate strategies. In many families, the person considered least powerful became the catalyst for significant transformation. Their influence was not attributed to intelligence or skill but dismissed as a coincidence. This allowed them to continue shaping outcomes without recognition. They preserved their perceived weakness, understanding that visibility reduced effectiveness. Their subtlety created room for maneuvering, and their lack of outward authority ensured that they remained part of the household's emotional landscape without becoming targets. Even when their decisions resulted in lasting changes, shifting loyalties, altering reputations, or adjusting the balance between relatives, the true origin of these shifts often went unacknowledged. The household adapted to the new structure, believing that events had simply unfolded naturally. Meanwhile, the woman who had identified the tension and acted at the decisive moment returned to her silent position, watching for the next imbalance. Her danger lay not in her presence, but in her invisibility. Everything described here reveals how the appearance of weakness could conceal deliberate intent. There were quiet observations made over the years that shaped decisive actions others never anticipated. Inside this carefully maintained silence, a single delayed gesture is preparing to redirect the household in ways no one is ready to confront. Stepping into a Tudor household as a new daughter-in-law meant entering a world already shaped by expectations she did not create. Every corridor carried the weight of family history, and every gaze measured her suitability for a role she had barely begun to understand. She walked carefully, spoke with restraint, and presented herself in the quiet posture expected of a young wife. To those around her, this softness confirmed their assumptions. She was pliant, inexperienced, and easily guided. Yet, beneath her calm exterior, She absorbed far more than she revealed. Her earliest days unfolded under silent evaluation. Relatives studied her behavior at the dinner table, observed how she greeted elders, and listened to the rhythm of her responses. Servants noted her tone, recording privately whether she possessed confidence or timidity. These assessments circulated quietly through the household, shaping unspoken judgments long before she had a chance to influence them. She understood instinctively that protest would only harden these impressions. The safest path was acceptance, at least for now. Behind her obedience, however, lived a mind intent on understanding the structure she had entered. She paid attention to the subtle details that others dismissed as ordinary. The placement of chairs in the hall revealed who held conversational authority. The shifting of servants' tasks signaled changes in internal loyalties. A mother-in-law's corrections, offered gently but firmly, showed which values mattered most to the family. The young wife carried these observations quietly, never allowing them to disrupt the soft demeanor she was expected to maintain. Politeness served as her first defense. It allowed her to move through the household unhindered, participating in routines without drawing suspicion. While she responded with calm agreement, her mind stored each slight, each overlooked gesture, and each moment of condescension. These memories did not harden into resentment. Instead, they formed a careful record of the household's fractures. Understanding these fractures meant understanding where influence might eventually be applied. Endurance shaped her daily life. She learned to navigate mornings filled with obligations, afternoons occupied by supervision, and evenings spent in rooms where every word carried weight. She adapted to corrections without argument, showing gratitude even when the instruction stung. Such compliance reassured the household that she posed no challenge to established authority, but she recognized that patience granted her something more valuable than approval. It granted her time. Time allowed her to witness how family members interacted when they believed she was not paying attention. A sister-in-law's forced smile revealed envy. A brother's abrupt tone exposed insecurity. A servant's hesitation before answering a question showed where fear lingered. She pieced these observations together slowly, forming a quiet understanding of the emotional geography that shaped the home. No formal map could have provided such clarity. It emerged only through accumulation. Year after year, a daughter-in-law learned which individuals sought dominance and which sought stability. She noted who approached her with genuine interest and who used politeness as a disguise. These distinctions mattered. They told her where alliances could grow and where caution was essential. By the time her presence in the household felt ordinary, she had developed a clearer sense of its vulnerabilities than those who believed they controlled it. Her influence began with small adjustments. A suggestion placed gently into a conversation redirected a decision without drawing attention. A carefully chosen gesture, an offer of assistance, a moment of withdrawal, a quiet expression of worry, shifted the behavior of those around her. These subtle actions appeared incidental, yet they altered the household's emotional balance. She relied on timing rather than force, knowing that overt demands risked provoking resistance. When disagreements arose within the family, she seldom inserted herself directly. Observing the conflict allowed her to see where loyalties bent under pressure. When she finally spoke, her words seemed natural, even inevitable, shaped by an understanding no one realized she had developed. Those who once dismissed her as passive began to reconsider her place in the home, though they could not pinpoint when their perception had changed. The discipline of waiting became her most powerful instrument. Waiting allowed her to select moments when her influence would be accepted rather than questioned. Waiting enabled her to respond without appearing reactive. Waiting kept her protected while she strengthened her position. In a household where confrontation endangered stability, this form of endurance was not a burden but a deliberate method. By the time the household understood her presence fully, she had already learned how to maneuver through its complexities. She appeared composed, dutiful, and loyal, all qualities valued highly. Yet beneath these visible traits, she carried a sharpened awareness of how to shift dynamics with minimal effort. Her actions remained understated, but their effects echoed through the family's routines in ways few recognized openly. Everything described here reveals how endurance can transform into deliberate influence. There were silent observations gathered over seasons that prepared her to act when the balance finally loosened. Beyond the calm she displayed, a single choice is already forming that will alter the household more than anyone anticipates. Sisters in a Tudor noble household grew up sharing the same corridors, the same lessons, and the same expectations. Yet their futures rarely aligned. Each girl learned early that her position within the family depended not only on birth order, but on beauty, temperament, marriage prospects, and shifting alliances around her. They were encouraged to support one another, to present a united face in public, and to uphold the dignity of their lineage. At the same time, they understood that the opportunities given to one sister might limit those available to the others. This quiet tension shaped their relationships long before adulthood. From a young age, sisters observed how relatives treated them differently. A slight increase in praise for one sister's skill, demeanor, or appearance created ripples that extended into their shared routines. A compliment meant for one girl could echo as a warning to the others. Parents, often without realizing it, signaled which daughter they believed would secure the most advantageous match. These judgments settled into the household like dust, visible only when the light shifted, but always present. Sisters learned to read each other's reactions, even when no words were spoken. Marriage intensified these subtle rivalries. Each sister understood that her future depended heavily on alliances formed through marriage arrangements. A favorable match elevated her position and indirectly shaped her siblings' prospects. Wealth, land, and influence were limited resources, and families often funneled their best opportunities toward the daughter deemed most likely to succeed. This created a pressure that was both shared and isolating. Sisters supported one another through preparations, fittings, and formal visits. Yet beneath their assistance lay an awareness that their fortunes were intertwined in ways that could not be separated. Despite these tensions, sisters relied on each other for information. They exchanged observations about relatives, commented quietly on shifting moods in the household, and shared warnings when alliances changed unexpectedly. These conversations formed a private world where they could express unease without fear of judgment. But the trust within this space was never absolute. Each girl withheld something, an insight, an intention, or a suspicion, out of caution. They understood that revealing too much could eventually weaken their position or provide another sister with an advantage. As they grew older, their personalities diverged, shaped by their experiences and the roles assigned to them. One might become the obedient daughter who fulfilled expectations without protest. Another might develop resilience through disappointment. A third might cultivate charm, recognizing that congeniality smoothed the path toward favorable connections. These differences did not erase their shared history, but they altered the balance of their relationships. Sisters who had once confided freely began to select their words carefully, aware that one day they might stand on opposite sides of a family decision. Events such as illness, betrothals, or changes in inheritance amplified this shifting dynamic. A sister who married advantageously could suddenly carry more influence within the household, even after moving away. A sister who remained unmarried longer than expected risked being perceived as a burden. These changes shaped how the sisters interacted during visits or gatherings. Warmth persisted, but beneath it lay a thread of calculation. Each girl measured the other's confidence, happiness, or unease, interpreting these signs as indicators of her own future. The household itself reinforced this duality. Servants watched the sisters closely, noting tensions or alliances that emerged between them. Relatives compared their accomplishments, often without intending harm. These comparisons created invisible boundaries that sisters navigated daily. At times, they became each other's greatest comfort, offering reassurance during moments of uncertainty. At other times, they became quiet opponents, competing for recognition or approval. Neither role completely overshadowed the other. Both existed simultaneously, shaping a relationship defined by complexity rather than simple affection. What made these bonds particularly intricate was the unpredictability of fortune. A sister who seemed favored one year might find her prospects diminished the next. A sister who once appeared insignificant could rise suddenly if her marriage secured unexpected influence. These shifts reminded them that their positions were never fixed. When one sister's destiny changed, the others felt the impact. Their relationships adapted constantly, stretching and tightening based on circumstances beyond their control. Through all of this, they maintained a surface of courtesy. Publicly, they treated each other with respect and affection. Private moments, however, revealed how deeply they measured each other's movements. They learned to offer support without revealing vulnerability, to ask questions without appearing suspicious, and to celebrate another's success while quietly assessing how it would reshape their own path. Their bond remained genuine, but it was shaped by the pressures of a world that demanded both loyalty and competition. Everything described here reveals how sisterhood carried both comfort and quiet calculation. There were shared confidences, shaped as much by caution as by affection, each one balancing trust against self-preservation. In the quiet space between their smiles, a shift in one sister's fortunes is already preparing to test the fragile equilibrium they depend on. Reputation in a Tudor noble household moved like a current, unsilent, persistent, and capable of reshaping everything it touched. While men believed their standing relied on land, alliance, or lineage, the true measure of a family's stability often depended on the perceptions shaped within and beyond its walls. Women understood this instinctively. They recognized that a whispered remark or a carefully crafted story could determine the outcome of a marriage negotiation, influence political decisions, or protect the household from scandal. Their ability to manage information became one of the most powerful tools available to them. Rumors did not spread accidentally. They traveled through hallways, across courtyards, and between servants' quarters with deliberate intention. A woman who wished to strengthen her family might soften a rumor before it grew teeth, redirecting attention towards something harmless. Another might amplify an existing whisper, letting it reach the ears of those who needed to hear it. The art lay not in fabricating stories, but in guiding what others were already inclined to believe. Once a perception settled, even the truth struggled to overturn it. Inside the home, reputation shaped every interaction. A daughter's behavior reflected on the entire household. A daughter-in-law's misstep could stain her birth family as well as her new one. A mother's ability to manage disputes subtly influenced how relatives perceived her competence. Women became custodians of these impressions, watching carefully for signs that others might be gathering information against them. They monitored conversations among servants, knowing that household staff acted as the primary carriers of news. A single misinterpreted glance could spark gossip, and once released, such gossip rarely vanished. Managing reputation required anticipation. Women studied the patterns of behavior around them, identifying which individuals responded to flattery, which to restraint, and which to silence. This allowed them to direct the flow of information with precision. A compliment offered in the presence of the right relative could solidify perceptions of loyalty. A private warning whispered to a trusted ally could prevent a misunderstanding from evolving into conflict. Each act served a calculated purpose, guiding how the household was seen both internally and externally. The stakes were particularly high when marriage negotiations arose. Suitors observed not only a young woman's appearance or manners, but also the stability of her family's reputation. Any hint of impropriety, a quarrel, a financial dispute, a poorly managed household, could diminish her prospects. Women, therefore, guarded their domestic image with vigilance. They curated stories about their daughters' virtues, ensured that servants repeated only approved accounts, and quietly removed those who could not be trusted to maintain discretion. Reputation prepared the ground on which negotiations took place long before formal discussions began. Political matters magnified this dynamic. A noble household could rise or fall depending on how others interpreted its behavior. Women used small gestures to project unity during gatherings, masking internal tension that might otherwise weaken their position. When political shifts occurred beyond the estate, they adjusted their social interactions to align with the emerging order. They knew that an ill-timed remark or a poorly concealed grievance could damage their standing in ways that took years to repair. Their caution did not stem from fear, but from understanding how fragile influence could be. Controlling the spread of rumors required subtle authority. Women could not openly command silence, but they could influence who spoke and who listened. A servant who repeated inappropriate stories might find her duties changed or her access to information restricted. A relative prone to exaggeration might receive fewer invitations to private gatherings. These adjustments rarely appeared punitive. They were framed as practical, even considerate. Yet they effectively reshaped the channels through which information traveled. This allowed women to maintain an invisible hand over the household's narrative. At times, reputation became a shield. When accusations or misunderstandings threatened the family, women relied on their carefully cultivated image to neutralize suspicion. Their consistent politeness, steady management, and public displays of unity created a barrier that others hesitated to breach. A household known for composure could dismiss minor scandals as unfortunate rumors. A family known for disarray, however, found itself unable to defend against even the smallest suggestion of wrongdoing. Women understood the difference intimately, yet reputation could also trap them. Once an idea took hold, whether true or false, it restricted their movements. A woman labeled overly ambitious might struggle to offer advice without attracting mistrust. One perceived as timid could find her authority dismissed, even when she spoke with clarity. These constraints required constant recalibration. Women learned to reshape their image slowly, through consistent actions rather than sudden displays. They adapted their tone, their presence, and their alliances to guide perception back toward a more favorable direction. Managing reputation demanded patience and discipline. It required understanding what others valued, feared, or envied. Women who mastered this skill became some of the most influential figures in their households, shaping the emotional and political environment without raising their voices. Their power was not obvious, yet it endured because it worked through belief rather than command. Everything described here reveals how reputation operated as the quiet architecture of power. There were carefully guided stories that shaped outcomes long before decisions were formally made. At the edge of these controlled whispers, a new thread of rumor is preparing to test how firmly this household governs its own narrative. Whispers in a Tudor noble household did not move loudly. They slipped across thresholds, threaded through corridors, and reached the wrong ears long before anyone realized the damage had begun. No one needed proof for a rumor to take hold. All it required was a quiet suggestion spoken at the right moment, by the right person, in the right tone. From there, suspicion unfolded on its own. A family that appeared stable in the morning could find itself unraveling by nightfall. Not because of anything done openly, but because of something barely audible. The danger of a whispered accusation lay in its flexibility. It could mean anything or nothing. Once released, it encouraged listeners to fill the gaps with their own fears, memories, and assumptions. A raised eyebrow, a faint pause in conversation, or a mildly worded observation could transform into a story of betrayal. Even those who dismissed the rumor publicly often carried a seed of doubt privately. In a world where reputation held more weight than fact, doubt alone possessed enormous force. Women understood this more clearly than anyone. They recognized how vulnerable a household became once uncertainty entered the conversation. A rumor about impropriety could jeopardize a daughter's marriage prospects. A suggestion of financial mismanagement could weaken a family's position among allies. A hint of disloyalty could sever political ties built over generations. These outcomes required no documents, no eyewitnesses, and no confrontation. They grew quietly, spreading through relationships like cracks beneath a polished surface. Servants played an unintentional role in this system. Their routines allowed them to witness moments others missed. Hurried conversations, temps silence, and unexpected visitors. They rarely invented stories. But their observations, repeated with minor variations, carried far. A servant's uncertainty, phrased as, "I cannot say for sure," but was often enough to ignite speculation. Households relied on these workers while simultaneously fearing the influence they wielded through small pieces of information. The structure of Tudor life amplified these risks. Families lived in close quarters, with little privacy and constant oversight. Doors remained open. Tasks required collaboration. Visitors arrived frequently, each carrying expectations and judgments. Under such conditions, any deviation from expected behavior became noticeable. A delayed greeting, a missed prayer, a closed door, or an expression caught at the wrong moment could inspire misinterpretation. Misinterpretation, in turn, invited whispering. Once suspicion formed, it rarely stayed contained. Relatives repeated the rumor to seek clarity. Neighbors shared it to protect the family, and allies discussed it to understand the situation. Each retelling changed the tone slightly, making the story feel more substantial even as it drifted further from the truth. The rumor, having multiplied, became something the household had to manage, regardless of whether the original claim held any validity at all. Attempts to control the whisper often made matters worse. A strong denial suggested defensiveness. Silence suggested agreement. Transparency risked revealing vulnerabilities unrelated to the rumor itself. Women, tasked with safeguarding the household's image, had to judge carefully how much to reveal and how much to ignore. The wrong choice could accelerate the damage. Even the right choice simply slowed it. A single whisper could also create conflict among family members. Doubt had a way of isolating people, pushing them to defend themselves or retreat from those they once trusted. Sisters questioned each other's intentions. Mothers scrutinized their daughters-in-law. Husbands reconsidered alliances. These fractures were subtle at first, visible only in tone or posture, but they could deepen quickly. A family divided internally became easy to manipulate from the outside. Some whispers arose unintentionally. A servant misunderstood a conversation. A visitor misheard a remark. A relative misinterpreted a gesture. Yet these accidental origins did not soften the consequences. Once the story circulated, intentionality no longer mattered. Perception took over, shaping belief more powerfully than any explanation could. The household might continue functioning outwardly, but beneath the routines lived a quiet erosion. Other whispers, however, were deliberate. A woman seeking an advantage might release a suggestion at dinner, wrapped in politeness and disguised as concern. She did not need to accuse anyone directly. She simply allowed others to consider possibilities they had previously ignored. Once the idea settled, she stepped back, letting the household's imagination complete the destruction. Such tactics required patience, discretion, and an understanding of human weakness. They were effective precisely because they left no trace. The aftermath of a whisper could endure for years. even when proven false. Suspicion often lingered, resurfacing whenever tensions rose. Families learned to fear the fragility of their own unity, recognizing that their greatest dangers came not from outside forces, but from unguarded moments inside their own halls. They adapted by tightening their expressions, restricting their conversations, and limiting who had access to sensitive information. Yet no household fully escaped vulnerability. Everything described here reveals how a single murmur could fracture a legacy built over generations. There were quiet suspicions that grew stronger, not through evidence, but through repetition and fear. Along the thinning silence in this household, one whisper is already beginning to reshape alliances in ways no one has yet sensed. Rooms reserved for women in a Tudor household appeared small and unremarkable to outsiders. Yet they carried an influence far greater than their size suggested. These spaces, bedchambers, sewing rooms, and private corners for prayer, were places where the household's most delicate conversations unfolded away from public scrutiny. Men did not enter these rooms without purpose, and because of that absence, women shaped their own rhythm of thought and communication inside them. The air in these rooms often felt quieter, but that quiet was the foundation on which strategy developed. The bedchamber, despite its association with rest, functioned as a private council hall. Women gathered there not for idle gossip, but to share insights, express concerns, or analyze the shifting dynamics of the household. A closed door gave them a rare sense of control. Words spoken softly carried clarity, not timidness. Decisions that affected marriages, alliances, or inheritance often began as whispered considerations in the space beside a window or near the edge of a neatly arranged bed. These conversations rarely appeared decisive at first. Their strength grew slowly, shaped by reflection rather than impulse. The sewing room offered another layer of privacy. Needles moved, fabric folded, and hands worked steadily as women spoke about matters they could not discuss in front of men, or even in public areas of the home. The repetitive motions created a sense of rhythm that allowed their minds to focus. Beneath the ordinary tasks of repairing garments or preparing dowries, they analyzed each relative's behavior, catalogued subtle mood changes, and considered how best to respond to emerging tensions. Actions taken later often traced their roots back to thoughts formed over thread and cloth. Spaces for prayer also carried strategic value. Though intended for contemplation, they became places where women could think without interruption. Kneeling in the dim light allowed them to examine not only their spirits, but their circumstances. They weighed alliances, evaluated risks, and considered the consequences of speaking or remaining silent. The solitude of the prayer rooms helped them clarify their intentions. Even decisions that appeared to arise from instinct were often the result of quiet deliberation shaped by these moments of retreat. In these private areas, women shared information that shaped the household's internal landscape. Servants, trusted for their proximity and discretion, delivered small observations that women analyzed carefully. A strange tone overheard between relatives, a missed chore that hinted at tension, or a sudden change in a visitor's behavior could reveal shifts in loyalty. Women did not act immediately on these details. They stored them, returning to them in their private rooms, where clarity felt easier to reach. Because men were absent, women were able to speak with a directness they rarely used elsewhere. They expressed doubts, admitted fears, and examined possibilities with unusual candor. This honesty allowed them to refine their strategies before presenting them publicly in a softened or more agreeable form. The household often believed major decisions emerged from formal conversations, yet many of them were already shaped by the time they left the boundaries of these private rooms. These spaces also served as neutral ground for negotiation among women themselves. Sisters, daughters-in-law, and mothers met there to resolve conflicts that would have disrupted the household if handled openly. They discussed concerns over inheritance distribution, corrected misunderstandings, and offered reassurances when anxiety threatened to overwhelm judgment. The intimacy of the rooms encouraged restraint, voices rarely rose, and disagreements unfolded with measured patience. Through this process, the family avoided fractures that might have widened in more public settings. Sometimes, these rooms became the starting point for subtle maneuvers. A woman who recognized a threat to her family's stability might share her concerns quietly with an ally, shaping a plan before presenting it to the wider household. Another might use the privacy to reveal information that needed to reach certain ears without implicating herself. The smallness of the space served as a protective layer, insulating the strategy until the right moment arrived for action. Though each room served a different purpose, they all provided separation from the demands of household life. This separation granted women the mental distance needed to assess situations with clarity. The ability to step back, even briefly, helped them anticipate complications before they escalated. It also allowed them to maintain emotional composure in public, since decisions made privately gave them confidence that their actions would carry intention rather than uncertainty. The influence of these rooms extended beyond the household's physical boundaries. A suggestion crafted in a sewing room could affect the outcome of a marriage negotiation miles away. A strategy refined in a bedchamber might shape a daughter's future in another estate. A decision formed in the stillness of a prayer space could alter the balance of relationships between noble families. The world outside rarely recognized where these choices originated. Yet their effects were undeniable. Everything described here reveals how small rooms governed the quiet architecture of family power. There were private conversations, shaped by calm reflection, that influenced events far beyond their walls. Along the edges of these hidden spaces, a new decision is already being made to redefine the household's direction. Ceremony in a Tudor noble household appeared orderly to anyone observing from a distance, but its structure served a purpose far more serious than politeness. Every gesture, every seating arrangement, and every moment of permitted speech contributed to the household's hierarchy. Women understood this deeply. They recognized that rituals were not simply traditions, but mechanisms through which authority was asserted and maintained. Those who controlled the ceremony controlled perception, and those who controlled perception controlled power. Seating arrangements were among the clearest examples of this quiet hierarchy. At dinners, gatherings, or informal meetings, where each person sat revealed their significance. Prominent positions near elders indicated trust and influence. Distant seats signaled diminished standing or temporary disfavor. A woman placed at the edge of the table might appear obedient, but she read the message clearly. She was expected to observe rather than guide. Conversely, a sudden shift, granting her a more central position, communicated growing acceptance or strategic necessity. Nothing about seating was accidental. Speech followed similar rules. Women learned when they were permitted to speak and when silence served them better. Some conversations required brief, carefully measured responses. Others demanded absolute quiet, allowing the authority of elders to remain unchallenged. When a woman chose to speak outside these expected patterns, even if her words were mild, the act itself could be interpreted as resistance. Those who mastered ceremonial timing shaped discussions without appearing dominant. Those who misjudged it exposed themselves to scrutiny. Rituals extended into daily routines as well. Morning greetings, mealtime behavior, entrances and exits from rooms, and the order in which tasks were completed all reflected a strict understanding of rank. A daughter-in-law who entered a room before a senior woman risked signaling impatience or arrogance. A sister who failed to stand when a respected relative approached suggested disregard. Women internalized these rules early, not because they enjoyed them, but because navigating them incorrectly carried consequences. Within these rituals lived a type of communication more precise than spoken language. A slight pause before sitting, a lowered gaze, or a deliberate hesitation conveyed acknowledgement of authority. Likewise, A subtly delayed response to an instruction could indicate disagreement without confrontation. Those observing understood these cues immediately. Ceremony allowed women to express things they could not say openly, using gestures instead of words to negotiate their position. Violating these rituals, intentionally or not, created immediate disruption. If a woman interrupted someone of higher rank, her action was interpreted not as simple impatience, but as a challenge to the established order. If she sat before being invited, the room recognized the breach instantly. Such moments often altered how relatives and servants viewed her, shifting the household's internal balance in ways she could not easily repair. Even minor missteps lingered, remembered long after the incident passed. Women who understood the deeper function of ceremony learned to use it strategically. By following every ritual flawlessly, they created an image of reliability and respectability. This image protected them from suspicion during moments of tension. When they needed to influence a decision, they could adjust their participation subtly. For example, speaking at a slightly unexpected moment to draw attention to concerns others had overlooked. Their adherence to ceremony in other circumstances made these deviations meaningful. New members of the household, especially daughters-in-law, often struggled with these expectations. They entered environments where unspoken rules shaped every movement. Their mistakes, though innocently made, were observed by all and whispered about afterward. Senior women guided them through these rituals, offering corrections that sounded polite but carried unmistakable authority. Over time, the young women learned that success in the household depended not only on competence but on understanding these invisible frameworks. The ceremony also acted as a boundary between what was permitted and what was private. Discussions about inheritance, alliance, or disputes rarely occurred outside structured gatherings. The ritual of assembling, greeting, and speaking in turn created a controlled environment where each participant understood her place. Even disagreements unfolded with restraint, shaped by the weight of ritual surrounding them. Without these boundaries, the household risked descending into disorder. Men, despite believing they presided over the household, often underestimated how effectively women used ceremony to guide outcomes. While men focused on formal authority, women shaped the daily flow of behavior. They managed greetings, coordinated gatherings, determined the tone of shared spaces, and corrected breaches before they grew into conflict. Ceremony gave them a quiet but steady influence, one that operated through consistency rather than display. In some cases, women deliberately manipulated the ceremony to expose tension. A mother might seat two conflicting daughters near each other to observe their reactions. A sister might delay a greeting to signal disappointment. These adjustments allowed women to test boundaries and gather information without confrontation. Through ritual, they learned who resisted, who adapted, and who sought to shift their standing. The strength of the ceremony lay in its familiarity. Because everyone understood the rules, deviations became unmistakable. Because deviations were unmistakable, women used them carefully. Ceremony preserved order on the surface while enabling negotiation beneath it. It shaped how the family functioned, how alliances formed, and how authority flowed. Everything described here reveals how ritual served as a map of hierarchy, guiding every movement through the household. Some gestures and silences shaped influence long before anyone spoke openly about intention. At the margins of these practiced routines, a quiet breach is already forming that will unsettle the order more than anyone expects. Patience in a Tudor noble household was not a quiet virtue, but a sharpened instrument, carried most effectively by women who understood the nature of endurance. They lived within a structure where direct defiance invited punishment, and unchecked emotion risked destroying carefully built alliances. Because of this, they learned to wait, calmly, deliberately, and with an intelligence shaped by long observation. Their power did not arrive suddenly. It gathered slowly, one season after another, becoming something stronger and more precise than any immediate reaction could offer. Daily life presented constant opportunities for irritation or insult. A dismissive gesture from a relative, a correction delivered too sharply, or a decision made without consulting them, all carried potential for resentment. Yet women restrained themselves. Instead of answering anger with anger, they responded with composed silence. This silence was not submission, it was calculation. By refusing to react instantly, they denied others the satisfaction of seeing them unsettled. They also bought themselves time to understand the situation fully before choosing the most effective response. In these households, memory played a central role. Women remembered everything: the tone of a remark, the timing of a slight, the pattern of someone's inconsistency. These memories were stored and examined later, often in the privacy of their small rooms, where clarity was easier to reach. They did not forget insults, but they also did not allow them to dictate reckless action. Instead, each offense became a piece of information, contributing to a broader picture of the household's shifting loyalties. Knowing when someone had acted unfairly allowed them to predict how that person might behave in the future. Patience also provided protection. Those who displayed immediate emotion risked being labeled unstable or impulsive. Those who responded too quickly revealed their vulnerabilities. But a woman who waited, who listened, observed, and replied only when the moment had truly settled, appeared controlled, even unassailable. Her restraint became a kind of shield. Others spoke carefully around her, uncertain how much she noticed. In truth, she noticed nearly everything. Endurance shaped relationships. 2. A woman who tolerated a difficult relative without complaint quietly gained influence over time. Her consistency earned trust from those who valued stability. Meanwhile, the person who caused trouble gradually lost credibility. No confrontation was needed. Patience handled the task. When conflicts arose, people often sought the counsel of the woman who had proven her reliability through years of measured behavior. Her authority deepened without noise or spectacle. There were moments when waiting transformed into opportunity. A woman might recognize that a relative who had once held power now showed signs of weakening, illness, diminished support, or shifting alliances. She did not rush to fill the space. Instead, she watched carefully, letting the change unfold. When she finally stepped forward, her action appeared natural, even necessary, because she had allowed everyone else to adjust their expectations first. What looked like good timing was often the result of long preparation. Patience also shaped how women handled threats. When rumors circulated or tensions rose, they did not confront the issue immediately. Confrontation risked escalation. Instead, they watched the rumor's path, identifying its source, its momentum, and the people who benefited from it. Only then did they intervene. Perhaps through a subtle conversation, perhaps through a gesture that shifted the household's attention elsewhere. These interventions succeeded because they were based on a thorough understanding rather than panic. In marriage, patience became a different kind of weapon. A wife who endured her husband's unpredictability, his alliances with relatives, or his shifting moods developed insight into his weaknesses. She learned when he sought approval, when he feared judgment, and when he needed reassurance. By offering or withholding these things at the right moments, she influenced decisions without appearing forceful. Her restraint allowed her to shape the household's direction from within, even if she never received public credit for doing so. Within female networks, patience nurtured enduring alliances. Friends and relatives who understood each other's quiet endurance formed bonds grounded in shared experience. These bonds strengthened across seasons of hardship. A woman who had once remained silent during a painful moment might later receive strategic support precisely because others had recognized her self-control. Endurance, in this sense, built a reputation that outlasted immediate conflict. Yet patience did not mean passivity. It required discipline, clarity, and the ability to separate emotion from strategy. It demanded careful observation and the willingness to wait for the moment when action would carry maximum impact. The women who mastered it held a kind of authority impossible to gain through force. Their strength lay in their consistency. Their decisions carried weight because they were never rushed. In a world shaped by male displays of power, their quiet endurance created an alternative path to influence. Over time, patience shaped the very rhythm of the household. Decisions unfolded gradually. Conversations lingered, and gestures carried meaning that words did not express. Women who embodied patience became the quiet center of this rhythm, steadying the household through uncertainty. Their influence was subtle but unmistakable, felt in every interaction, even if rarely discussed openly. Everything described here reveals how patience matured into a steady form of power. There were measured silences and long-held memories that allowed women to guide events without ever raising their voices. Through these restrained choices, a moment is already forming that will reveal just how deeply endurance has shaped the balance of this home. Power inside a Tudor noble household did not rise and fall within a single lifetime. It moved through generations, carried in gestures, lessons, and quiet warnings passed from mother to daughter. Women understood that influence required more than immediate victories. It required foresight, an awareness that the choices made in one season could echo decades later. Rather than seeking triumph in the moment, they shaped strategies that unfolded slowly, sometimes too slowly for anyone outside the family to notice. Their efforts were rarely recorded, yet their effects shaped the household long after they were gone. Children observed early how their elders behaved during moments of tension. A daughter watched her mother hold her silence when insulted, choosing not to respond until the household's mood shifted in her favor. She saw how a grandmother's casual remark at dinner subtly redirected attention, reshaping a conversation without appearing forceful. These moments imprinted themselves deeply, forming the foundation of a girl's understanding of power. No formal instruction was needed. The house itself taught her, one quiet exchange at a time. A mother's guidance rarely arrived through direct speech. Instead, she shared knowledge in fragments. Small comments about a relative's temperament, warnings about when to speak and when to wait, reminders of how easily reputations could fracture. These hints accumulated, building a framework that the daughter would rely on later. Over time, the girl learned to recognize patterns, who held real authority, who pretended to, and who influenced events through subtle means. She also learned that alliances formed in childhood often grew into partnerships in adulthood. Generational strategy extended beyond relationships. Women prepared their daughters for futures they might never see fully realized. They taught them how to manage servants, how to read expressions during negotiations, and how to interpret silence as clearly as spoken words. These lessons were not meant to solve immediate problems, but to equip the next generation for challenges that had not yet surfaced. The daughter who absorbed these teachings became the woman who would eventually pass them forward again. In some households, long-standing rivalries persisted for decades, shaping behavior long after the original conflict had faded into memory. A daughter learned which relatives could be trusted and which alliances required caution. She inherited not only her mother's warnings, but also her unresolved tensions. These inherited dynamics influenced how she greeted guests, how she interpreted remarks at gatherings, and how she positioned herself within the family's internal hierarchy. Though the original dispute might have ended years before her birth, its residue continued to guide her choices. Women understood that planning across generations required patience. They planted seeds through marriages, aiming to strengthen their family's positions slowly, as daughters married into households with compatible interests. These alliances expanded influence gradually, building networks that stretched beyond the household's walls. Each marriage served as both a strategic move and a safeguard for the future. Even if immediate benefits were small, long-term stability grew from these carefully aligned relationships. Mothers also passed down strategies for handling adversity. When a scandal threatened the family, they guided their daughters on how to preserve dignity, manage rumors, and maintain alliances. A daughter learned how to carry herself during scrutiny, how to avoid appearing defensive, and how to redirect attention without drawing suspicion. These skills ensured that the family survived crises not just once, but repeatedly, as challenges reappeared across different generations. Some strategies focused on silence, on withholding information that could weaken the family's position. Women taught their daughters the value of keeping certain truths hidden, not out of deceit, but out of protection. They understood that not every detail needed to be shared, and that restraint often preserved unity. This careful management of truth allowed the family to weather conflicts that might otherwise have torn it apart. Other strategies emphasized memory. Women remembered how their elders had navigated previous conflicts, what decisions had strengthened the family, and which errors had cost them dearly. These memories became guideposts. Daughters inherited them as part of their legacy, using them to shape responses to new challenges. Thus, the household's collective experience extended far beyond any individual life. Over time, each generation contributed to the ongoing structure of power. The strategies shifted slightly with changing circumstances, but the core remained: wait, observe, act with intention, and think beyond the present. No single woman controlled the entirety of the family's direction, yet each left a mark through the lessons she carried and the lessons she passed on. Their efforts created continuity, allowing the household to adapt without losing its fundamental rhythm. This continuity gave the family resilience, even when fortune shifted or external threats emerged. The women's interwoven strategies formed a quiet defense. Daughters stepped into roles their mothers had once held, adjusting methods but preserving purpose. What seemed like instinct was often inherited discipline. What looked like a coincidence was usually the result of choices made long before. Everything described here reveals how influence gained strength by stretching across generations. There were lessons carried forward quietly, shaping decisions long after their original voices had faded. At the fading edge of these inherited strategies, a new move is already forming that will test whether the household truly understands the legacy guiding it. The future of a Tudor noble household often rested in the hands of a boy who had no understanding of the weight placed upon him. While men claimed responsibility for shaping heirs, it was usually the women, mothers and aunts, who molded the young successor's mind long before he recognized his position. Their influence reached him in small, consistent ways, through the tone of guidance, the stories chosen for instruction, the expectations woven quietly into daily routines. Because their presence surrounded him from infancy, their impact settled deeper than any formal lecture he later received from male relatives. A mother's role began early. Long before her son learned to speak, she set the rhythm of his world. When he rested, how he was comforted, how he responded to tension. Her reactions to conflict, disappointment, or pride became his first leadership lessons. If she approached challenges with restraint, he learned to do the same. If she favored observation before action, he carried that habit into adulthood. These shapings were subtle but firm, shaping his instincts before he developed his own reasoning. As the heir grew older, his mother's influence shifted from emotional guidance to strategic preparation. She watched how he interacted with servants, noting whether he understood the importance of kindness without surrendering authority. She corrected his posture, his tone, and the way he interpreted disagreements. A boy rarely realized that these adjustments prepared him for the negotiations and expectations awaiting him. Mothers understood that power demanded composure, and they cultivated that composure slowly. Long before the boy learned the vocabulary of leadership, aunts played their own role, especially those who lived within the household. They offered perspectives that a mother could not always provide. Some aunts had witnessed disputes between relatives. Others had navigated difficult marriages. And still others carried insights shaped by their own mistakes. Their advice, filtered through quiet conversations, gave the heir a broader understanding of family dynamics. A mother might teach him caution, an aunt might teach him how to identify sincerity. Together, their guidance formed a complex map of human behavior. Women also shaped the heir's understanding of loyalty. They taught him which alliances had kept the household stable and which old conflicts still lingered beneath the surface. Through everyday comments, an observation during a meal, a suggestion while walking the grounds, they imparted the family's unwritten history. These details, preserved across generations, helped him avoid mistakes that had damaged earlier successes. By the time he reached adolescence, he often held more knowledge of the family's long-term strategy than many of the men who advised him formally. The heir learned early to interpret women's behavior as signals. A change in his mother's expression during a gathering taught him caution. A subtle shift in his aunt's voice reminded him to reassess the room. He understood that women rarely acted without purpose. Their restraint became a model for his own restraint. Their patience became a lesson in timing. He absorbed these qualities gradually, turning them into habits he would rely on once he inherited responsibility. Women also shaped how the heir understood authority. They demonstrated that power did not always need volume or aggression. Influence could grow quietly through consistency. A mother who managed the household effectively showed him that order required attention, not force. An aunt who settled disputes without raising her voice taught him the value of measured intervention. These examples tempered the more aggressive concepts of leadership he might hear from male relatives, creating a balance that made him more adaptable and observant. As he approached adulthood, the heir's interactions with the women who shaped him evolved. He began to recognize their strategic thinking, even if they rarely named it openly. Their advice grew more pointed. Their cautions became sharper. They guided him through early mistakes, helping him understand when he had spoken too quickly or trusted too readily. They reminded him that his actions reflected not only his own character, but the stability of the entire household. Their influence, however, did not end when he became the official head of the family. Even as a grown man, he consulted the women who had raised him, seeking their perspective during uncertain times. A mother's quiet warning could redirect his decisions. An aunt's suggestion could reveal the true intention behind another relative's proposal. Because these women knew him from childhood, they recognized patterns in his behavior and helped him avoid decisions rooted in impulse rather than judgment. Through the heir, women gained indirect power. Their insights shaped his choices. Their values guided his priorities. Their memories of past conflicts informed his alliances. Though they rarely appeared at the center of formal discussions, their influence traveled through him into every major decision he made. In this way, the women of the household extended their reach beyond their prescribed roles, shaping the future without stepping into the spaces denied to them. This indirect authority endured long after they left the world. Their lessons remained alive in the heir's instincts, influencing the way he raised his own children, managed crises, and interpreted challenges. Generational strategy continued through him, carried forward without explicit acknowledgement, but with undeniable effect. Everything described here reveals how women shaped the heir long before the world recognized his authority. There were steady lessons and quiet examples that formed the foundation of his judgment long before he understood their purpose. Through these inherited impressions, a new shift in his behavior is already preparing to alter the household's balance in ways the family has yet to anticipate. Loyalty in a Tudor noble household was never a simple matter, especially for women who lived between two families the moment they married. A daughter left her birth home, with expectations placed firmly upon her shoulders. Yet the new household she entered carried its own demands, its own tensions, alliances, and concealed ambitions. Her decisions, spoken or unspoken, influenced not only her future, but the standing of both families. She learned quickly that affection alone could not guide her. Survival required strategy, caution, and an understanding that loyalty was rarely singular. From the beginning, she felt the pull of two worlds. Her birth family had shaped her values, her instincts, her earliest sense of belonging. Their needs did not disappear once she married. They simply became quieter, folded into letters, visits, and coded messages shared during brief reunions. Meanwhile, her husband's household expected immediate devotion. Relatives watched her behavior closely, searching for signs of divided allegiance. Even small gestures, lingering too long with a visiting cousin, reacting too warmly to news from her childhood home, could raise suspicion. Women learned to move carefully through this tension. Their loyalty could not be declared openly. It needed to be demonstrated through consistent behavior. Supporting her husband's family earned stability. Yet, ignoring her birth family risked insulting those who once protected her. She walked a narrow path, adjusting her tone and presence depending on who stood beside her. This shifting balance was not deceitful. It was necessary in a world where missteps carried lasting consequences. When conflicts arose between the two families, her role became even more complicated. Each side expected her to represent their interests subtly, without violating propriety. She served as an informal messenger, interpreting requests and concerns that could not be spoken directly. Yet she also needed to protect herself. If she pushed too strongly for her birth family, she threatened her place in her marital home. If she supported her husband's relatives without restraint, she risked injuring lifelong bonds. Her choices revealed not her desires, but her ability to read the political landscape. Strategy guided these decisions more often than emotion. Women recognized that their influence, though quiet, could shape the future of both lineages. A single recommendation made at the right moment could secure a marriage alliance. A carefully chosen silence could prevent a dispute from escalating. These were not grand gestures, but subtle adjustments. A shifted word, a softened remark, an observation offered gently to redirect attention. In these ways, she protected her position while advancing the interests of those she cared for. Despite her strategic awareness, she felt the emotional weight of each decision. She remembered the faces of her siblings, the lessons of her mother, and the familiar routines of her childhood. These memories influenced her instincts, urging her to defend her origins when conflicts threatened them. At the same time, she could not ignore the reality that her marital household now shaped her daily life. It held her security, her reputation, and her children's futures. Loyalty, therefore, stretched across two directions, neither of which could be abandoned. Many women discovered that the most effective loyalty was indirect. Rather than advocating openly for either side, they worked to keep the peace between them. They encouraged patience during disputes, softened harsh messages, and framed disagreements as misunderstandings rather than provocations. This role required emotional discipline because she often absorbed the frustration of both families while revealing none of her own. Her calmness became a kind of buffer, preventing tension from spilling into open conflict. Personal feelings rarely determined her choices. Even when she longed to defend her birth family fiercely, she understood that doing so might destabilize her new position. Even when she favored her husband's household, she recognized that appearing too committed could weaken her ability to mediate effectively. Her emotions did not vanish. They simply retreated behind a practiced composure that allowed her to act with intention rather than impulse. Over time, she became fluent in the unspoken rules that governed loyalty. She learned when to speak softly about her birth family, framing their actions as reasonable rather than defensive. She learned how to show commitment to her husband's relatives without appearing disloyal to her origins. Eventually, her loyalty took on a layered form. It existed not as a single allegiance, but as a network of responsibilities, each requiring careful observation. What outsiders rarely understood was that her loyalty ultimately rested not on love or obligation, but on maintaining stability. If either household fell into ruin, she suffered as well. Her role, therefore, was to ensure continuity, to keep doors open, relationships intact, and conflicts contained. In this way, her loyalty transcended individual demands and became part of a larger, ongoing strategy that stretched beyond her lifetime. Everything described here reveals how loyalty demanded quiet negotiation rather than certainty. There were careful choices shaped by duty, caution, and the pressure to protect both homes without revealing her inner conflict. From these delicate adjustments, a turning point is already forming that will force her to choose with more consequence than either family understands. Failure in a Tudor noble household did not arrive with sudden noise. It came quietly, through small shifts in behavior, closed doors, and conversations that stopped when a woman entered the room. A woman who once held subtle influence could find herself slowly pushed to the edges of the household's affairs, watching decisions unfold without her input. Isolation was not announced. It formed gradually, becoming visible only when she realized that the routines she once guided now continued without her presence. For women who lived in a world shaped by careful observation and long-cultivated alliances, this collapse felt like both a personal loss and a public warning. The earliest signs were slight. Relatives began consulting others before speaking to her. Servants who once reported to her directly shifted their loyalties toward another woman, whose authority seemed to rise inexplicably. Invitations to gatherings arrived later, or not at all. She might still be treated with politeness, but the warmth beneath that politeness cooled. The structure of the household had rebalanced itself, and she was no longer part of its center. Her influence diminished, not through confrontation, but through absence. Losing access to decision-making often meant losing access to her children. In Tudor families, children belonged not to their mothers, but to the lineage itself. A woman's authority over them depended entirely on her standing within the household. Once she fell from favor, her time with them could be quietly restricted. A grandmother or sister-in-law might assume responsibility for their education. A husband might support these changes out of convenience rather than malice. She watched her children adopt the habits and expressions of others, recognizing the slow erasure of her own presence in their lives. This loss extended to property. A woman rarely controlled her own assets, yet she could influence how they were managed, until her position weakened. When her reputation declined, so did her ability to guide financial matters. Decisions about land, dowries, and inheritance moved beyond her reach. Even her personal belongings might be reassigned under the pretext of necessity. Though the changes appeared administrative, their impact was unmistakable. She no longer held any meaningful authority. Reputation, once damaged, proved nearly impossible to restore. A single whisper, an accusation of mismanagement, a suggestion of disloyalty, or a rumor of inappropriate behavior could spread faster than any defense she attempted to offer. People remembered the rumor long after they forgot its origin. She found herself trapped by impressions she could not correct, her silence interpreted as guilt, and her explanations dismissed as desperation. In a world where perception outweighed truth, her decline became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The household's internal dynamics reinforced her downfall. Those who once depended on her adjusted their loyalties, aligning themselves with whoever emerged as the new center of influence. Servants changed their routines. Relatives altered their tone. Even children sensed the shift, instinctively gravitating toward those with clearer authority. She witnessed these transformations with a mixture of clarity and helplessness. She understood exactly what was happening, yet she lacked the leverage to stop it. Women who fell from power learned how fragile their position had always been. They recognized that authority grew not from titles but from trust, perception, and strategic silence, and that losing any one of these weakened all the rest. They also discovered how easily a household rewrote its own history. Her years of contribution faded into selective memory. Relatives spoke of past decisions as if she had never shaped them. Her role shrank in stories told to younger family members, becoming smaller with each retelling. This erasure carried consequences beyond her lifetime. A damaged reputation affected her children's prospects, making suitable marriages harder to secure. Allies hesitated to associate closely with a family perceived as unstable, even when the next generation behaved impeccably. The stain lingered. The household's name, once spoken with respect, softened into cautious tones. Her failure, though personal, became collective, a reminder of how interconnected daily choices were with the family's long-term stability. Yet failure did not always result from poor judgment. Sometimes it came from misreading a shifting alliance. Sometimes from trusting the wrong person. Sometimes from simply being present when another woman sought advancement. The unpredictability of these shifts made the fall even more devastating. A woman who believed herself secure discovered too late that influence had moved elsewhere while she remained still. Despite this, many women faced their failure with quiet endurance. They continued their routines, maintained decorum, and accepted reduced roles with dignity. They understood that open resentment would only deepen their isolation. Their restraint did not repair their standing, but it preserved a sense of self-respect within a structure that offered little room for recovery. In rare cases, patience allowed them to regain a small measure of influence, though never to the extent they once held. Everything described here reveals how easily influence could crumble once perception shifted against a woman. Some losses unfolded silently. Children pulled away, responsibilities reassigned, and years of labor recast as insignificance. From this quiet unraveling, a deeper fracture is already preparing to expose how fragile the household's balance truly is. The history of a Tudor noble household did not preserve every voice. It remembered those who succeeded, those who negotiated well, those who maintained alliances, and those who appeared steady in moments of uncertainty. The ones who faltered, women who lost influence, misread a shift in loyalty, or simply stood in the wrong place when power changed direction, slowly faded from the household's collective memory. Their stories did not disappear suddenly, but drifted into silence, replaced by narratives shaped by those who remained in positions of authority. This erasure was not dramatic. It unfolded in small, steady steps until nothing recognizable of the woman remained. The first sign of forgetting occurred in daily speech. Her name came up less frequently during conversations. Tasks she once managed were described as though someone else had always been responsible. Decisions she had influenced were retold without acknowledging her presence. Her contributions dissolved into the background of household routine, treated as if they had been inevitable rather than deliberate. Those who once sought her advice redirected their attention toward other women whose influence seemed more secure. Within a few months, she felt herself becoming peripheral even before anyone openly excluded her. Over time, the household stories began to shift. Moments where she had acted with care or foresight were reduced to coincidences. Her past authority was reframed as overreach. Her silence during conflict was interpreted as weakness rather than restraint. These reinterpretations spread quietly, shaping how younger members of the family understood their own past. A new narrative emerged, one that justified her fall from influence by recasting her as someone who had never truly belonged at the center. This process allowed the family to move forward without acknowledging the instability that had contributed to her decline. Documents reflected this forgetting as well. Letters once addressed to her directly shifted toward others. Family records described events with vague phrasing that erased her involvement. When births, inheritances, or alliances were recorded, her role was noted only when necessary, and often without detail. These omissions rewrote her importance in a way that seemed natural rather than intentional. Even objects she once treasured, books, linens, and small personal items, were redistributed without mention of their origin. Her presence survived only in material fragments that no one associated with her anymore. Within the household's physical spaces, traces of her faded too. A chair she once preferred now belonged to someone else. The bedchamber she managed became a place where another woman organized her strategies. Servants stopped referring to routines in connection with her name, adopting the methods of the new authority figure instead. The infrastructure she had built, habits, schedules, and unspoken expectations, remained, but the acknowledgement that she had built them vanished entirely. Her influence endured only as an anonymous structure. For women in Tudor households, this quiet erasure represented the most severe consequence of losing power. They did not fear physical punishment as much as they feared being forgotten. Memory, after all, was the only form of permanence available to them. Without it, their work dissolved, their intentions disappeared, and their years of discipline became indistinguishable from the lives of countless others who had passed through the estate unnoticed. The silence around their names became a final judgment. Even in moments when the household needed to reference its past, women who had fallen from favour were mentioned cautiously. If at all, their decisions were spoken of as mistakes. Their alliances were described as misguided. Their failures were emphasised not to condemn them personally, but to justify the choices of those who replaced them. The narrative served a purpose. It reassured the current leadership that the household's order was natural and correct, and that those who had been forgotten had simply not belonged within it. The sorrowful truth was that younger generations learned nothing of these women beyond vague warnings or unfavourable anecdotes. A granddaughter might inherit her temperament, but not her story. A daughter-in-law might walk past her portrait without recognising the face. A son might repeat judgments formed long before he understood their meaning. Without stories to counter these impressions, forgetting became permanent, yet within the private reflections of a few observers. Servants who had once respected her, relatives who had quietly admired her restraint. Small memories lingered. They recalled her discipline, her insight, her careful management of tension. But these memories lived only person to person, not in the household's collective narrative. Once those individuals passed away, their recollections disappeared with them. The final stage of erasure occurred when the household began to speak of its past as though the present structure had always existed. The woman's absence became integrated into this imagined continuity. Here, rise, her influence, her decline, all vanished beneath the smoothing hand of time. The silence surrounding her was not anger, nor resentment, but a kind of indifference that declared she no longer held relevance to the family's identity. Everything described here reveals how disappearance became the final consequence of losing influence. There were names softened into obscurity, stories retold without their rightful voice, and memories reshaped until they bore little resemblance to the lives that inspired them. Between these fading recollections, a deeper silence is already preparing to expose what the household chooses not to confront about its own past. The landscape of a Tudor household shifted whenever politics beyond its walls changed shape, and the women inside learned to adjust with a precision that kept them relevant. They understood that influence depended not only on what they did, but on how well they sensed the direction of power before anyone named it aloud. Their strategies evolved quietly, shaped by observations, by the rhythm of court rumours, and by the alliances that rose or crumbled in distant chambers they would never enter. Adaptation became a constant practice, not an occasional choice, and those who mastered it retained their footing even as the ground rearranged itself beneath them. Some women adapted by altering the impressions they projected. When the political climate favored restraint, they cultivated a softer presence, speaking less and listening more. When confidence was valued, they appeared with firmer posture, clearer speech, and sharper attention. None of these changes was dramatic. Instead, they accumulated through subtle gestures that made them appear attuned to the expectations of the moment. Maintaining relevance required adjusting tone, expression, and timing, ensuring that they fit the household's shifting needs while still safeguarding their private intentions. Others adapted by recalibrating their relationships. They strengthened ties with relatives whose status was rising and loosened their attachment to those whose influence showed signs of weakening. These realignments happened quietly. A longer visit, a shared prayer, an exchange of small gifts. Each gesture repositioned them while appearing innocent. Women understood that bonds within the family shifted faster than official titles did. By anticipating who would matter most in the coming months, they placed themselves in favorable proximity long before anyone else recognized the value of doing so. This flexibility extended to how they expressed power. A woman whose authority once came from managing the household might redirect her focus toward guiding the upbringing of children if that path offered more stability. Another who had relied on the approval of older relatives might shift her attention toward influencing the younger generation. Recognizing that new alliances often began much earlier than people realized. The ability to adjust these expressions of authority allowed them to maintain significance without drawing unwanted attention. Their adaptability also appeared in how they adopted or abandoned certain behaviors. When modesty became the preferred display, they emphasized calm demeanor and measured speech. When displays of devotion earned respect, they became more visibly engaged in prayer and charitable acts. These changes were not signs of insincerity but reflections of survival. Women understood that appearing out of step with prevailing expectations could threaten their standing more than any direct conflict ever could. Their behavior, therefore, aligned with whatever upheld the stability of their position, even if privately they held different beliefs. Beyond behavior, their understanding of risk evolved with the times. In periods of heightened tension, they avoided actions that could be interpreted as ambition. They reduced their involvement in disputes, chose their words with greater caution, and moved through household spaces with deliberate quiet. But when the political atmosphere relaxed, they seized opportunities for influence, for negotiation, for subtle redirection of events in their favor. They recalculated their approach constantly, shaping their decisions according to the risks that shifted from week to week. Even their appearance became part of this adaptation. They observed which colors, fabrics, and styles signaled steadiness, humility, or refinement. Clothes offered a language understood by everyone who lived within the household's hierarchy. A gown chosen carefully could soften tension or reinforce authority. A hood worn slightly differently could suggest maturity, loyalty, or careful neutrality. These outward signs allowed women to signal alignment without saying a word, protecting their intentions behind layers of fabric that changed with circumstance. Despite this constant adjustment, the emotional weight of adaptation remained heavy. Women learned early that influence was never secure. Every gesture mattered. Every silence mattered. A misinterpreted action could unravel months of careful positioning. Their resilience was not celebrated, it was expected. They bore the burden of adaptation quietly, understanding that endurance required them to shift their strategies repeatedly, even when they longed for a moment of stability. Yet adaptability did not mean surrender. It meant survival. It meant staying present in the household's evolving structure rather than being pushed into the margins. It meant shaping the future by adjusting gracefully to the present. Those who succeeded preserved not only their influence, but also the stories that defined their place within the family. Their ability to move fluidly through these changes became the quiet foundation of their strength. Everything described here shows how adaptation allowed Tudor women to keep their influence alive. No matter how unstable the world became, there were shifting tactics and carefully managed appearances that helped them survive changes that would have undone others. Across the quiet surface of this household, a silent exchange is beginning to pass from mothers to daughters, ready to alter the balance in ways still hidden. They learned early that nothing in a Tudor household was spoken plainly. Girls grew up watching the movements of their mothers, aunts, and grandmothers, absorbing lessons that no one ever voiced. A lowered gaze could mean defiance. A pause before answering could mean suspicion. And the way a woman arranged her sleeves before entering a room could reveal her entire strategy for the day. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was forgotten. Every gesture belonged to a lineage of women who had survived long before them. Power in these families did not pass through documents or formal teachings. It passed through routine. Subtle, relentless, and disciplined. A girl might sit quietly near the hearth while the women discussed household matters, seeming to pay attention only to her stitching. Yet she was watching who served tea first, who waited before speaking, who asked a question rather than issuing a command. The hierarchy was not written down, but she learned it by heart. She learned who controlled the food, who managed alliances with neighboring families, who handled the household accounts, and who held the authority to punish servants. These observations formed the foundation of her future influence. The younger generation often understood danger faster than the older generation expected. Even before puberty, a girl could sense tension in the air, a silence between two women, a smile that held too long, a door closed with unnecessary care. These signs taught her far more than any explicit warning. She learned that survival was not about strength, but about timing. When to speak, when to hide, when to accept humiliation temporarily, and when to store it away for later use. She learned to read the room with the skill of a seasoned diplomat. Mothers rarely explained these lessons outright. Words were risky, words could be repeated. Instead, they shaped their daughters through example. A mother who endured a slight without reacting taught patience. A mother who allowed a rival to take the spotlight taught a strategy. A mother who comforted a servant at the right moment taught loyalty management. These were not sentimental displays. They were political tools disguised as everyday behavior. The daughter watching would eventually understand their meaning when she faced her own battles. Sometimes the most powerful lessons came from the failures of others. A girl might witness an aunt losing her position in the household, slowly pushed to the edges of decision-making. She might see how a cousin's careless remark resulted in suspicion that took years to erase. These were warnings carved into memory. Every misstep became a quiet cautionary tale, passed from one generation to the next without anyone needing to speak a single word. The transfer of power also took place through objects. A mother gave her daughter a piece of jewelry, not for decoration, but for symbolism. A ring worn by the grandmother, a brooch associated with negotiations, a ribbon once used in a ceremony that shifted the family's fortunes. These objects were silent messengers, reminders of the strategies and sacrifices that kept the family stable. They served as anchors, connecting daughters to the long chain of women who had shaped the household before them. As daughters grew older, their understanding deepened. They learned the subtle distinctions between obligation and opportunity. They practiced the polite firmness needed to decline a dangerous alliance. They refined the delicate tone required to reassure someone without promising anything. They mastered how to appear cooperative while maneuvering for advantage. None of these skills appeared dramatic or forceful, yet they were essential for maintaining influence in a world where their formal authority remained limited. In time, the daughter stepped into the spaces once occupied by her mother. She inherited responsibilities that had never been formally assigned. She took control of household rituals. She influenced the education of younger siblings. She advised her husband on matters he believed he understood on his own. This transition was seamless because it had been rehearsed through observation for years. Only when she acted did she realize how much she had absorbed without ever being taught directly. The strength of this system lies in its invisibility. Outsiders rarely noticed how power was being passed. Even the men within the household often overlooked the quiet exchanges happening around them. They assumed authority rested in their hands, unaware that the true continuity of influence was being woven through the daily routines of the women. What seemed like ordinary life was in fact a carefully constructed method of preserving stability across generations. To the Tudor household, this unseen education was as vital as land, wealth, or lineage. Without it, the family's future would be uncertain. With it, daughters stepped into adulthood already prepared for the pressures awaiting them. 2005. They carried not just their mother's expectations but their strategies, their resilience, and their unspoken warnings. Power survived because women ensured it did. Not loudly, not openly, but with the precision of those who understood that silence could preserve a legacy as effectively as any decree. Everything described here shows how influence traveled quietly from one generation of women to the next, through observation rather than instruction. There were unspoken lessons shaped by gestures, to routines, and failures, guiding daughters toward roles they were expected to inhabit long before they understood them. Before the household settles again, a new thread of inherited strategy is already forming, prepared to reshape how the next woman will hold her place. Power in a Tudor household rarely ended when a woman died. What she shaped, concealed, manipulated, or endured persisted long after her absence. Families carried forward the habits she established, the alliances she nurtured, and the grudges she silently tended, even when no one spoke her name. Her influence remained embedded in the structure of the household, felt in how decisions were made, how people interacted, and how every new wife entering the family learned, very quickly, which boundaries were safe and which were not. Generations later, descendants often acted according to patterns they did not fully understand. A young woman might adopt the same caution her grandmother once perfected, lowering her eyes in moments where a sharper gaze could provoke suspicion. A daughter might inherit a tendency to negotiate through hints rather than declarations. These behaviors were not taught consciously. They were absorbed from years of watching women survive within a confined system. The household became an archive of strategies, each quietly passed down, forming a set of expectations that shaped every interaction. The legacies of these silent games influenced even the architecture of family roles. A daughter-in-law entering the home found herself navigating dynamics shaped by women she never met. She sensed invisible rules governing where she stood, how she addressed the matriarch, when she offered advice, and when she remained silent. These expectations were the residue of past maneuvers, old victories, old wounds, old compromises that still dictated the atmosphere of daily life. In this way, power long outlived the person who wielded it. Over time, the unspoken codes became so familiar that no one questioned their origins. A specific ritual before meals, a rule about who handled letters, a pattern dictating which woman oversaw the servants. These were traces of earlier negotiations, earlier competitions, and earlier attempts to maintain control. Even the men, who believed themselves the natural rulers, unknowingly followed routines born from women's strategic adjustments generations before. This persistence gave female influence a strange durability. What could not be acknowledged publicly still operated privately with full force. The household recognized these rules, even if the world outside refused to admit they came from women. Power did not need official titles. It only needed continuity. And continuity was something Tudor women excelled at preserving. Their methods were adaptable, subtle, and deeply rooted in daily life. Some of these legacies carried a protective function. A woman who once shielded her children from an oppressive relative might have crafted routines or alliances that later generations continued without understanding their original purpose. A bond between two branches of a family could remain strong due to the actions of a long-gone matriarch who brokered peace behind closed doors. Even a quiet rivalry between cousins might trace back to a conflict between two women whose disagreement shaped the emotional geography of the family for decades. Other legacies were heavier. A family known for strict discipline might unknowingly follow a pattern established by a grandmother who survived humiliation by enforcing rigid control over her household. A tendency towards suspicion or secrecy might descend from a woman who once endured betrayal. These inherited responses preserved stability, but they also carried shadows, fears, and tensions that persisted long after their origins were forgotten. The most striking part was that these outcomes unfolded without formal acknowledgement. No one announced that a certain woman had reshaped the family. No chronicles recorded her influence. Yet her presence remained in behaviors, expectations, and rituals that continued out of habit rather than memory. The family's identity, its strengths, its weaknesses, its unspoken rules, often bore the imprint of women who, in their own lifetime, were denied recognition, even when the lineage expanded. When marriages introduced new households and new personalities, the old strategies survived. Each new generation adapted them, bending them to fit shifting political climates or personal ambitions. What had once been a defensive maneuver might transform into a path to greater influence. A gesture that once protected a woman from scrutiny might become a symbol of refinement or virtue. Each iteration shifted slightly, yet the core of the strategy stayed intact. This invisible inheritance shaped the future as powerfully as any land or fortune. It guided the behavior of daughters who never realized they were following a pattern hundreds of years old. It influenced marriages, conflicts, alliances, and the rise or decline of entire branches of a family. Behind every ritual and every polite smile lay the accumulated weight of countless decisions made by women who refused to disappear, even if the world pretended they had no role at all. Everything described here shows how silent strategies survived long after the women who created them were gone. Some habits and rituals carried their influence forward, shaping families without ever revealing the hands that set them in motion. Before the lineage settles into familiar patterns again, a new form of inherited power is already preparing to surface in ways no one fully anticipates. It is difficult to stand inside a Tudor household and claim with certainty who held the reins. Authority was loud, but influence was quiet, and silence had a way of bending the walls more effectively than any spoken command. Those who appeared to rule, fathers, husbands, and heirs, believed themselves the center of family order. Yet every room in the house told a different story. Behind gestures of obedience, behind carefully folded hands and lowered eyes, another current of decision-making moved steadily, often unnoticed until its effects had already settled into place. The question of power was never answered by titles, but by the subtle paths through which individuals shaped outcomes. A man might issue a command, but a woman decided how it was interpreted. Softened, delayed, or quietly redirected. She chose which servant heard which instruction, which daughter learned which lesson, which visitor received warmth, and which received distance. These choices were small in appearance, yet vast in consequence. They determined alliances, tension, the rhythm of the household, and the future of the next generation. In this way, power scattered itself through tiny decisions, through the gentle reordering of daily life, through the influence of someone who rarely raised her voice. What made this dynamic even more elusive was the gap between what the outside world believed and what the household experienced. Publicly, a Tudor family mirrored the rigid hierarchy of its era, men at the forefront, women in the background. But the background was not empty. It was filled with observation. negotiation, and quiet strategy. A woman could ruin a reputation with the smallest withdrawal of kindness. She could strengthen a marriage alliance by shifting her daughter's behavior at precisely the right moment. She could redirect her husband's anger, reshape household finances, or position herself as the emotional center everyone depended upon. These abilities were rarely acknowledged, yet they shaped the household more deeply than any official authority. Even a woman with no formal status, an aging aunt, a widowed sister, a seemingly timid daughter-in-law, could become the true stabilizing force if she understood how to manage the family's emotional climate. Power, in the Tudor world, was not a fixed object, but a moving pattern, changing hands depending on who paid attention, who remembered, who understood the weight of silence, and who recognized the opportunity hidden beneath a polite smile. The heart of the mystery lay in the distinction between issuing orders and directing the conditions under which those orders made sense. A man might tell the household what to do, but a woman shaped the circumstances that determined whether those commands were effective. She chose which truths reached him and which did not. She decided when a conflict needed soothing and when it needed space. She measured the temperament of each family member and used that knowledge to guard or guide them. Her influence spread quietly, settling into places no decree could reach. Yet the most revealing part of this dynamic was the question of visibility. Those who seemed powerful were often the least aware of how power actually moved. They believed authority was something that could be displayed, spoken, or enforced. They overlooked the possibility that the person standing a few steps behind them, smiling warmly, keeping careful silence, was the one shaping outcomes with far greater precision. Those who appeared fragile, uncertain, or obedient sometimes understood the household far better than those who attempted to control it openly. And this leads back to the central question. After everything, who truly commanded a Tudor household? The one who spoke the loudest? Or the one who guided those words into meaning? The one who carried the family name? Or the one who ensured that name survived through alliances, quiet negotiations, and subtle corrections? Power hid itself in gestures so delicate that contemporary observers failed to recognize them. But the household recognized them. Generations later, the patterns still carried the imprint of women whose influence had never been officially acknowledged. A smile at the dinner table might not seem significant, yet it could mend a brewing conflict or strengthen a hidden alliance. A pause before answering a question could shift the entire trajectory of a conversation. A choice to confide in one servant over another could redirect the flow of information through the house. These actions did not resemble power as the era defined it. Yet they formed the skeleton of the household's evolution. Every woman who survived long enough to understand the rhythms of her family contributed to this intricate structure. Perhaps that is why whispers lingered longer than commands. A threat spoken softly, coated in courtesy, carried more weight than a raised voice. A suggestion framed as concern could move mountains that force could not. The household was built on layers of interactions, each shaped by those skilled enough to understand the quiet spaces where real authority lived. This was the true legacy of Tudor families, power woven into daily life. Impossible to name, impossible to erase. By the time one asks who ruled the household, the answer has already dissolved into the walls. The rituals, the habits that persist long after the individuals themselves are gone. Power is not always visible. It does not always stand in the center of the room. Sometimes it sits by the window with folded hands, listening carefully. Sometimes it hides in the pause before a reply. Sometimes it looks like a gentle smile that conceals an entire strategy beneath its calm exterior. Everything described here reaches toward one lingering truth. Influence in a Tudor household rarely matched the appearance of authority. There were layers of intention and carefully placed gestures shaping the family in ways only a few ever understood. Before we leave this world of courtesy and concealed threats, a final question hangs in the quiet air. How many of those polite smiles were warnings no one recognized in time? And now, as this story closes, may you let the weight of these hidden lives settle gently. Power leaves echoes, but silence leaves deeper ones. Rest in the thought that history is shaped not only by those who made noise, but also by those who mastered stillness. Good night, and may your sleep be soft.